The human didn't just bow. She executed a flawless sweeping motion of the hips, compensating for the absence of a tail, followed immediately by a deep, submissive neck tilt that exposed the vulnerable, fluttering pulse at her throat. Kalis blinked, her inner nictitating membrane snapping shut in pure shock. Beside her, Vaughn's cranial scales shifted rapidly from an anxious, defensive violet to a stunned, neutral green. Then the human reached up, tapped the sleek silver node behind her ear, and turned her universal translator entirely off. When she spoke, the sibilant, clicking consonants of High Court Zylari rolled off her tongue with terrifying perfection. It turned out hiring a Terran sector guide was the single most nerve-wracking part of their new posting. Just 3 days ago, Kalis and Vaughn had been pacing the heated floors of their high-security suite on Sol Station, their heavy claws clicking a restless rhythm against the metal decking. The air in the room smelled of synthetic terrarium moss and the aggressive, dry heat required to keep their cold blood moving. They had sat surrounded by glowing digital dossiers, agonizing over the risk. Sol Station was a political pressure cooker. Their 3 hatchlings needed supervision. More importantly, they needed a bridge between biology and bonding in a completely alien ecosystem. A traditional Zylari caretaker would keep the children safe, but culturally isolated. Humans were widely perceived as soft, hairless, fragile. They seemed remarkably ill-equipped to handle a nursery full of sharp teeth, young claws, and territorial hissing. They had argued late into the station's artificial night cycle. Vaughn wanted the safety of a homeworld guardian. Kalis argued that true security required local expertise. They compromised on scheduling exactly 1 interview. Elena Vance, a highly recommended graduate of the Terran Diplomatic Academy, and now this seemingly fragile primate, was standing in their living quarters dismantling their prejudices with surgical precision. Cultural competence, Kalis realized, with a sudden thrill of awe, was this species' true superpower. "My credentials, esteemed elders," Elena hissed smoothly, her pronunciation of the honorific carrying the exact inflection required for a formal introduction. She slid a data tablet across the heated obsidian table. Vaughn picked it up, his talons tapping the glass. He had expected to see basic dietary guidelines and emergency communication protocols. Instead, he was looking at a breathtaking display of excellence through extreme preparation. The first page detailed exhaustive coursework in Zylari physiology, including thermal regulation management, joint articulation, and the psychological volatility of the first major scale molt. But it was the second page that made Vaughn's heavy tail twitch in disbelief. "Protective Custody Level 5, Kalis read aloud, translating the Terran military designation into their own language. She looked up at the unassuming woman in the sharply pressed gray uniform. "This certification requires evasive orbital piloting and close-quarters kinetic suppression," Elena added softly. She offered a polite, close-mouthed smile, carefully hiding her blunt teeth, a calculated, deeply respectful gesture to avoid triggering any latent predatory aggression in her hosts. "I am fluent in your language, trained in your defense." Vaughn looked at Kalis. His throat sac expanded, a silent physiological expression of absolute wonder. This human was not just a caretaker. She was the ultimate cross-species shadow. Back on Earth, they might have called a woman like this a Mary Poppins for the interstellar age. To the Zylari diplomats, she looked like an answer to anxieties they hadn't even known how to vocalize. "Would you like to meet them?" Kalis asked, her voice dropping to a low, trusting rumble. The heavy blast door to the nursery hissed open, releasing a wave of aggressive, dry heat that smelled faintly of crushed minerals and shed keratin. Inside, 3 small, jagged shapes immediately scrambled up the artificial rock wall. The hatchlings pressed themselves against the heated stone, their immature scales flushing a defensive, angry crimson. They hissed, a sharp, rattling sound meant to ward off predators. Elena did not back away. She didn't offer a soothing human platitude either. Instead, she dropped to a low crouch, making herself smaller than the eldest hatchling. Her gaze swept the cluttered floor, landing on a scattered pile of toys. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and picked up a battered metallic object. "A Takala-class interceptor," she murmured, the sibilant clicks of the native tongue rumbling perfectly from her soft, human throat. She set it down and pointed to a brightly painted figure nearby. "And a scale-bright warrior. The third iteration, if I am not mistaken. With the deployable wrist blades." Up on the wall, the hissing abruptly stopped. The eldest hatchling, a male with newly hardened crests, tilted his head. The defensive crimson rippling across his hide began to fracture, giving way to patches of curious mottled green. Elena didn't push. She simply reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. The unmistakable clatter of crag-jump stones echoed in the quiet room. She tipped the pouch, spilling the carved obsidian pieces onto the heated floor. It turned out the universal language of children wasn't just play, it was superiority. Elena began to arrange the stones into the starting formation of the complex strategy game, moving with slow, deliberate clumsiness. She placed a heavy defender stone 2 squares too far to the left. A sharp chirp of indignation echoed from above. The eldest hatchling dropped from the wall, landing with a soft thud. He marched right up to this strange, hairless creature, snapped his small jaws in a show of dominance, and shoved her defender stone into the correct defensive pocket. Elena lowered her head, exposing her neck in a miniature version of the greeting she had given his parents. She yielded, and just like that, the tension in the room shattered. The other 2 hatchlings scrambled down, chittering excitedly, forming a tight, eager circle around the human. Outside the room, Kalis and Vaughn stood frozen before the security monitor. Vaughn watched the thermal feed. The harsh, erratic heat signatures of his children were smoothing out, their scales settling into a deep, relaxed gold. And the bridge between biology and bonding was happening in real time, orchestrated by a primate who had studied their world until she could breathe it. Vaughn didn't say a word. He simply raised his data tablet, pulled up the long-term contract, and pressed his biometric seal against the glass. A second later, he deleted the entire queue of remaining candidate interviews. Back on the screen, the game of crag jump concluded. Elena stood up, her movements fluid and calm, and gestured toward the open archway of the play quadrant. The hatchlings trotted ahead of her, their tails swishing in absolute contentment. But Kalis caught the microshift in the human's posture. As Elena followed the children into the corridor, her playful demeanor remained, but her physical center of gravity dropped. She positioned her body perfectly between the hatchlings and the primary access door. Her soft, binocular eyes swept the hallway, tracking the ventilation grates, calculating the distance to the nearest blind corner, scanning the corridor for 100 invisible threats. She was playing a game with the children, yes, but she was already guarding the nest. Kalis leaned against Vaughn, the rough friction of their scales a comforting anchor. They had hired a caretaker, but they had gained a warrior. The galaxy was a vast, unpredictable place, but inside their home, the human held the line.